You get clearance? I asked as Kim approached my workstation. Some questions about a cousin with a big following on Instagram, but that's about it, she replied, shrugging. Not the weirdest background check I've been through. I don't get why I need more clearance just to walk into this place, though. It's about containment, I explained. It's not that anyone thinks you'll steal military secrets, although, to the right people, my drones are worth a fortune. I patted the sleek black hull of the car-sized submersible sitting on the workbench. It's more about preventing leaks, especially with the whole social media thing. What's here? Well, it's not your everyday project. Has Alex filled you in? Yeah, he did, she answered. I'm guessing that's... She nodded toward the massive pressure chamber taking up most of the room. I didn't believe it when Alex first told me, she continued. They're saying it's some inland sea sealed off for over 100,000 years, and the pressure down there keeps it liquid? That's the story they're selling, I replied. But the truth is, no one really knows. Unlike Lake Vostok, no one had any clue this thing even existed until it was discovered. Alex's team was here for meteorological work, nothing more. Then how did they drill a tunnel down to it if they didn't even know it was there? Kim asked, stepping past me toward the chamber's steel door. My guess? They were up to something they shouldn't have been, I said, following her. I wouldn't be surprised if the US government's involved in all sorts of things down here. Either that, or Alex's story is true. And trust me, that's hard to believe. What did he tell you? He said the hole appeared on its own. I shrugged. The chamber was built later, just to access it and stop the water from flooding up under the pressure. Kim leaned forward, wiping the condensation off the small glass window in the steel door. Maybe that's why they want us to keep quiet, she muttered. Maybe they don't know what's down there yet. They want to figure it out first before calling it the scientific discovery of the century. Kim stood on tiptoe to peer through the glass, looking down into the water. Below was a small room, its floor covered in churning black water that never settled. The movement of the water reminded me of an ocean in miniature, its waves relentless. Sometimes when I stared too long, it felt as if I was looking down on some ancient, monstrous sea from hundreds of feet in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that, whatever was beneath it, it was wrong. Something ancient, deep, and impossibly old. You have to wonder what's down there, Kim muttered. I didn't answer. The world seemed to fade into the background. All I could focus on was the water swirling hypnotically in the glass. Then, for a split second, something changed. The water shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, and I thought I saw something.
Moving beneath the surface, something long, something wrong. It slithered just below the waves, vanishing before I could make out what it was. I shook my head, trying to shake off the thought. Come on, I told Kim. We've got work to do. What's that? Alex asked, his finger pointing toward the flickering video feed on the massive 100-inch screen. For the last 20 minutes, all we'd seen was nothing but black, grainy static as the drone descended into what had been named Lake Saturn. The room was tense, filled with a dozen people, all of us watching in silence as I gripped the joystick with white-knuckled intensity. I didn't see anything, I replied. Probably just interference. If anything gets too close, we'll know. The lights on this thing are powerful enough to cut through solid rock. What are we expecting to see down there? Kim asked, her tone skeptical. I'd be shocked if there's anything multicellular down there. It's been sealed off from the outside world for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, out of nowhere, a pale, thin tentacle shot past the camera. It was unnaturally fast, its size and speed almost mismatched. The entire room recoiled instinctively, as if expecting the creature to lunge through the glass and drag us into the depths. For a few seconds there was stunned silence. Then the tension broke as people gasped, chuckled nervously, and a few scientists even shouted in triumph before rushing to smaller desks to analyze the footage. Well, now we know, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Multicellular life. Another tentacle appeared, this time followed by a slight jolt in the drone's sensors. The accelerometers registered a kinetic shock, though we saw nothing unusual on the screen. The camera still only showed pixelated darkness. It's just checking us out, I said, eyes locked on the sub's instruments. The submersible was nudged slightly from side to side, hardly an attack, more like a curious brush. It lasted only a few seconds before the creature retreated back into the depths as quickly as it had appeared. Jesus, Kim gasped. The ventral camera and LiDAR systems are measuring it at 30 feet long. The world record for a verified specimen was 22 feet, I said. So, that's the first record we've broken on this mission. Kim and I burst into laughter, like excited kids at the best discovery ever. A few seconds later, the others joined in, the tension broken, replaced with disbelief and excitement. I've never been so happy to be wrong, she grinned. Life. Honest-to-God multicellular life. There must be an entire ecosystem down there. Predators, prey, who knows what else. Bacteria, fungi, maybe even plants. The sub descended further. Occasionally, sonar picked up strange shapes moving through the water, but nothing came close enough to be captured visually. It was unsettling, though. Despite being completely safe in the sub, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease.
I imagined myself down there, submerged in that pitch-black water, surrounded by unseen creatures moving silently in the dark, just a few meters away. It took another hour before we were within 30 feet of the bottom. I slowed the sub's descent and turned the downward-facing cameras to look for signs of the lakebed. What appeared on the screen was beyond anything I expected. An array of strange, irregular rocks. There were spiraling ammonites and lifeless shells everywhere, and strange bones protruded from what appeared to be an endless field of bone-white death. What is that?" I muttered, unable to tear my eyes away. "Animals must have been trapped here when the water froze over," Alex said, his voice grim. "Graveyards of creatures are common when excavating dried-up lake beds." "This is normal?" I asked. "No," he shook his head, a look of disbelief on his face. "Not like this. Not so many." "Talk about an understatement," I muttered, spiraling the drone outward. Every camera revealed the same horrifying sight, an endless plain of bones stretching out in every direction. If there was a floor beneath it all, we couldn't see it. "So what does the squid eat?" Kim asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "If everything in the lake's dead?" Almost as if to answer her, the portside camera picked up the slow movement of a massive pale starfish. It crawled out of the nasal bone of a long-dead whale, probing its surroundings, its movements eerie and deliberate. "It's 30 feet wide," I said, squinting at the readings on the screen. "Do starfish even grow that big?" Most of the biologists were too busy scribbling notes to answer, but Alex glanced up from the screen and answered calmly. "Absolutely not," he said. "It must have grown that big due to a lack of predators." A fish, larger than the drone itself, flashed across the screen and the starfish disappeared. In that brief moment, I caught a glimpse of something, a glassy, transparent set of teeth and an eyeless face, more grotesque than anything I'd seen at the Challenger Deep. Wrinkled, frowning, it was an aquatic nightmare that left me shaking in my seat. "What the hell?" Kim groaned. "Jesus Christ, that was—" "Not that," she said, tapping me on the shoulder and pointing toward another monitor. "There's something strange 100 yards east. We need to check it out." She reached for the controls, but I stopped her. Despite the overwhelming urge to turn back and get the hell out of there, I felt an almost compulsive need to keep going. I grabbed the joystick and began to steer in the direction she'd indicated. My eyes locked on the readouts, unable to tear them away from the numbers. I didn't notice I'd lost focus on the main screen until— "Holy shit!" I snapped my gaze up, worried I'd made a huge mistake and wrecked the drone. But what I saw made my body go limp. We were staring at a structure. A building, in fact. A temple, perhaps. I couldn't say for certain if it was a place of worship, but there was no other way to describe it. The ancient pillars, the decorative flourishes that resembled those of ancient Greece, it was unmistakable. Confused, I released the controls and leaned back, my head tilting to the side like a dog hearing an unfamiliar sound. After a few seconds of stunned silence, I muttered, "Is this a prank?" Some of the scientists around me exchanged looks, with Kim and several biologists nodding, turning to Alex, the head of the facility. But the expression on his face made it clear that if this was some sort of elaborate hoax, he was just as clueless as the rest of us. He looked pale, his eyes wide, every bit as shocked as we were. "Why would we do that?" he asked, his voice shaky. "How would we even manage it?" "Those steps are 30 feet tall," someone exclaimed, cutting through my thoughts. I glanced away from the screen and saw a geologist standing by a smaller monitor, filled with complex readings. "Can you get closer?" he asked. I looked back at the drone's camera, now focusing on the first of 20 massive steps rising from the lakebed toward the temple. The steps were colossal, each one a massive slab of stone towering over the drone. "This is real?" I whispered, turning to Alex as he moved closer to me. He nodded, his gaze glued to the screen. I glanced back at the screen. We were now floating over the steps, and from the height of the temple, the full scale of it became apparent. The doorway, a vast, yawning black portal, towered above us, several hundred feet tall. It loomed over the submersible like a giant looming over an ant. Our lights barely reached into the darkness beyond, but they illuminated a stony floor that stretched into the void, its surface covered in strange, snow-like detritus. In the distance, another tentacle slithered briefly into the light before vanishing back into the depths. Its pale, lifeless form, moving in the murky waters, sent a chill through me. When I glanced at the people around me, I saw I wasn't the only one whose nerves were starting to fray. Pale, sweaty faces stared at the screen, their gazes fixed in disbelief, clearly rattled by what they were seeing. Here was a building, standing at the bottom of the world, impossibly tall, impossibly vast, its doorway beckoning us forward into the unknown. "Should I keep going?" I asked, hoping someone would provide a good reason to turn back. It didn't matter that I wasn't physically down there. I didn't want to push any further into this madness. Fear gripped me, and no matter how much I told myself that the abyss was miles beneath me, I couldn't ignore the terrifying reality of it all. Somewhere beneath our feet lay that void, and within it, a temple beyond all human understanding. The thought made my mind burn. "Keep going," Kim said, her voice steady, even though I could tell she was just as shaken. "We need to know." Her words echoed in my head. There was no turning back now. We had to know what was down there. Nervously, I pushed the drone forward, my heart hammering as the side cameras showed us edging closer to the portal. It was as if I could feel the cold draft creeping over me, like I was stepping into the temple myself. I shivered, trying to push the ridiculous thought aside. The room beyond us was vast, impossibly so. Our meager lights barely cut through the endless blackness. After what felt like an eternity of heart-racing silence, I finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Do the instruments pick anything up? I feel like I need some guidance here." We're picking something up just south of your position. It's stationary, so it should be." Before the words were even finished, the entire room screamed as the drone's camera violently shook. The image on the screen spun wildly, as though the drone was being thrown about by some unseen force. Alarms erupted from monitors all around us as every system registered severe anomalies. My hands froze on the controls, paralyzed by the chaos unfolding. A sharp spike of adrenaline hit me, my body reacting as if it had been physically assaulted. But then, instinct and training kicked in. I let go of the joystick and waited, my mind racing as a flurry of bubbles and strange shapes darted past the drone's lens. "The drone's tough," someone reassured the team. "It can take more than this. Not even a creature can damage it. We just need to wait." Eventually, the alarms began to quiet down as different team members scrambled to shut them off. I focused intently on the accelerometer. Whatever was attacking the drone had begun to slow down. It seemed to realize its prey wasn't worth the effort. "Looks like another squid," someone observed, pointing to a dorsal camera where a long, slimy feeler was wrapped around the drone's hull. "Just wait," I said, trying to keep calm. "It's out of our hands now. But if we're patient, it should just leave us alone." For the next few minutes, the drone moved on its own accord, tossed around by some unseen entity. Occasionally a glimpse of the temple's ceiling appeared, mosaics of fleshy mountains, beautiful stone pillars cradling ancient braziers, but there was no time to properly study them. They passed by in fleeting blurbs of color and form. Whatever was down there seemed to treat the submersible like prey, tugging at it as though it expected to feast. But I knew, sooner or later, it would realize that the drone wasn't food. "Look," whoever shouted, didn't need to. The creature, having thoroughly examined the drone, came into full view. It slid around the sleek hull, angling itself toward the forward camera. It loomed in the display, as if aware that we were on the other side of the lens, its eyeless, cone-shaped head fixed on us. I couldn't tell if it was angry, curious, or just indifferent. It simply stared. Then, as slowly as it had appeared, the creature retreated from the light. But it wasn't done with us. One of its longest tendrils remained wrapped around the drone, using it to tow us back toward the entrance of the temple. "Well, this is exciting," I muttered, a nervous laugh escaping my lips. "Looks like it's throwing us out of its house." Kim shot me a doubtful look. "You're not seriously suggesting it built that thing?" "No," I replied. "Why build steps if you don't have feet? It's probably just moved in. Seems like a great shelter." The creature stopped at the doorway. And then it did something I never expected. It changed color. The soft spectral white of its body flashed into a pulsating blood orange, shimmering and undulating as though it were some sort of living light show. We all stared, entranced by the bizarre behavior. A threat display, maybe? Kim wondered aloud. Before anyone could respond, the squid shrank away, releasing the drone just at the temple's entrance. A quick glance at the rear camera revealed it fleeing back into the black depths. I was about to ask what had just happened when suddenly a strange cerulean light filled the doorway. An eye. It wasn't just any eye. This was a glowing, pupilless, pale blue sphere that seemed to pulse with an unsettling malice in the dark. It blocked the doorway entirely, a ghostly orb that lingered for a moment. Then, as if aware of its own terrifying presence, the owner of that eye retreated. A monstrous shape loomed in the darkness, its form barely illuminated by the faint bioluminescence that clung to it like a dark halo. A silhouette emerged, a shape so alien that, if it hadn't moved, I might have mistaken it for a plant or a strange rock formation. It reminded me of tumors or wasp nests, its surface covered in an intricate pattern of dots and frills. At the center of its head, a grotesque, bubbling mass the size of a small apartment block, countless eyes blinked at us, each one seemingly aware of our presence. With a rising tide of horror, I realized that I had glimpsed simple, almost primitive depictions of this very creature in the temple's mosaics. The realization hit me like a brand of heat pressed to my brain, a searing truth that burned through all my rational thought. This thing, shattered everything that made sense. It loomed in the darkness just beyond the reach of our lights, its presence a palpable weight that crushed any semblance of safety or reason. The rest of its body was hidden, shrouded in shadow. But I hated it. I hated it with a deep, gut-wrenching instinct, even as my mind tried to grasp its significance. I told myself it was the scientific discovery of the century, that this was a breakthrough that would change everything. But none of that mattered. It made my skin crawl, my stomach drop, and all I wanted was to lash out and flee as far as I could from that monstrous presence. Slowly, it raised a writhing, branching appendage toward the drone. That was when the feed went dead. The wind outside howled with ferocity. The facility where we were staying sat on a desolate plain, far from civilization, its lonely position near a cluster of inland mountains, exposing it to the full brunt of the Antarctic winds. The gusts swept down from the mountain slopes, gaining speed as they barreled across the plain at terrifying velocities. It never snowed in Antarctica, but that didn't stop the hurricane-force winds from whipping up tiny ice particles and throwing them with incredible force. The result was a whiteout, an endless gray void that surrounded us, leaving nothing visible outside the windows. No sky, no sun, no ground beneath the foundations of our elevated building. "It's almost too much," Kim murmured after a while, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "If we'd just found a jellyfish or something, it would have been strange, but people would have believed us. But this is like something out of a bad movie. How am I supposed to get up at a conference and present this footage?" Kim, Alex, and I were seated in the canteen, the warmth of the room contrasting sharply with the howling storm outside. The other scientists had dispersed to their rooms to begin the monumental task of sifting through the endless readings and data we had collected. Every pulse of sonar, every fluctuation in temperature and pressure, every bit of infrared. It all had to be analyzed, cataloged, and understood. For some, it was likely a comforting task, a way to focus on the tangible details, hiding from the insanity that had begun to unravel around us. "You know what I think?" Kim said, breaking the silence. "Forget about the results. I want to leave. Let someone else get the glory. Even if we wanted to, Alex said, the storm's going to keep us grounded for at least another week. Kim gave a dry laugh. Just as long as I'm on the first flight out when it's clear. Maybe we can talk about leaving once the storm clears, I said, trying to steady the conversation. But for now, we've gathered enough data to keep us busy for a lifetime, and we have the equipment to analyze it. Sir? A young man burst into the room, cutting me off. I immediately recognized him as part of the security team that had arrived with me. The armed men had been keeping to themselves, separate from the scientists, and until now I had almost forgotten they were there. The man who stood before us looked far from bored. He looked worried, anxious even, completely out of his depth. Alex, who the man had addressed, stood up quickly. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. "There's been a breach, sir," the young man said. "Something's entered the chamber." "How do you know that?" Alex demanded. "We can hear it, sir." We rushed to the ground building, our hearts racing as we tried to process the unfolding crisis. The facility had two immediate problems now, and neither of them were ones we could ignore. The first immediate problem was that the pressurized chamber was under intense stress. Internal readings indicated that water had flooded the room, placing immense pressure against the reinforced walls. So far, they were holding, but the pressure was steadily building, and we knew that, sooner or later, something would give way. The second problem was the sound emanating from within. Each strike made me flinch, physically recoiling from the bulkhead with a jolt of fear. I tried to mask my anxiety, but as I glanced around, I realized it wasn't necessary. Alex, Kim, and the security guard were just as terrified. Something was inside that chamber, something that had risen from the lake below and was now methodically tapping against the walls with unnerving precision. The sound seemed to whisper its presence. "I am here. I am here, and I want to meet you." "We need to release the pressure," Alex said, his voice shaky, his face drained of color. We need to. "I'm not opening that door," Kim snapped, her tone firm. I glanced at the pressure readings, feeling my stomach tighten. "It's not giving us a choice," I said, my voice low. "If that structure fails, it'll be worse than any bomb going off." "All the more reason not to open it," Kim cried. "Think about what you just said. It's not giving us a choice. Do you want to play that game?" "We don't know what it wants," Alex replied, his voice quieter now. "We don't know what it is." Maybe what?" she interrupted, incredulous. "Maybe it's here to play chess? To be our friend? Is that seriously what we're proposing?" "If that chamber blows," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we'll get answers to those questions whether we like it or not. We can retreat to safety, sure, but it doesn't solve anything. Besides, it doesn't have to be the door we open. There are valves specifically for pressure release. We can use those to stop it from blowing." If Kim had any counter-arguments, they were swallowed up by the noise. The walls of the chamber groaned as something, a screw, a bolt, shot out and punched a hole through the ceiling. "Alex," I said, my voice rising with urgency, "help me get the pressure valves open." "This is insane," Kim shouted, her voice breaking as I walked over to the nearest valve. The knocking stopped just as my hand gripped the wheel. I exchanged a glance with Alex, who was sweating despite the cold. He hesitated, standing a few feet away from me, looking lost, like he was in shock. "I need help," I said firmly. "Okay," Alex muttered, nodding absently, his mind elsewhere. "Come on," I cried, pointing urgently to the opposite side of the valve. Alex jumped at the force of my shout, but after a moment he shuffled over to help. "Alex, we don't need to do," Kim started to say before her words were cut off. The final blow was louder than any of the others, like thunder crackling next to my ear. It was an explosive punch, delivered with unerring precision. The valve broke open just as Alex passed by the opening. Water surged out with tremendous force, enough to send him flying backward. The internal mechanisms worked quickly to control the flow, preventing the blow from being lethal, but the force was brutal. Alex was knocked across the floor, and the water surged out in a furious torrent. I could see him floundering under the dark brine, struggling, and I silently thanked God he was still alive. Without thinking, I rushed to drag Alex away from the churning water. My heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out across my back as the terrifying realization set in. Whatever had attacked the chamber, It had done so with impossible insight. It was watching us. It knew what we were doing. I focused on Alex, pulling him out from the water. His leg was trapped under some debris, but I paid little attention to it, intent only on getting him clear of the surging flow. But then, something caught my eye. A glistening black tendril, like a grotesque spider's leg, was wrapped around his head. My breath caught in my throat, and I recoiled in horror. I stumbled backward, collapsing onto the floor in shock. The others, Kim and the security guard, screamed in disbelief as they saw what had ensnared Alex's head. It was a grotesque cluster of alien muscle, dark and slick, connected to a long, writhing tentacle trailing back through the open valve. "Get it off!" I screamed, my voice echoing across the room, hoping someone would have the presence of mind to act. Alex's struggles were growing weaker by the second. Before any of us could react, there was the faintest sound of tightening fibers, followed by the tendril retracting back into the chamber. It slipped effortlessly through the 6-inch wide opening without slowing or showing any sign of resistance. And then, with a sickening sound like silk tearing, it took most of Alex with it. I made the decision to withdraw from the study, from the site itself. Kim was visibly relieved, and so was I. The excitement we had once felt over the discovery had vanished, replaced by the haunting memory of having to clean up Alex's remains. I knew I would never forget the weight, or lack thereof, of the body bag when I lifted it. It barely weighed more than 20 kilos. We had discovered something truly nightmarish in that lake, and the brief moments we had survived were enough to plague my thoughts for years. Unfortunately, the storm was still in full force outside, and we wouldn't be able to evacuate for at least another 3 days. Kim and I stayed busy packing up our equipment, but since her expertise lay in data analysis rather than engineering, there were times when the work fell entirely to me. It was on the second night that I told Kim to head to bed early while I wrapped up the last bit of work. Only minutes after she left, I found myself standing in front of the chamber, an imposing structure that loomed in the center of the room like some bizarre obelisk. The memory of that thing, it glaring at us through the screen, returned in vivid detail, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. With a shiver, I decided to finish packing in the morning. Being alone in that place, even for a few minutes, was a decision I now regretted. "Stephen?" The voice was a whisper, sharp and electric, sending a tremor through my limbs. My hands faltered, and equipment clattered to the floor, barely audible beneath the weight of the sound.
All my attention locked onto one of the speakers attached to a station at the back of the room. It was connected to one of the geologists who had lowered microphones during the initial dive, using them to record an audio profile of the lake below. With everything that had happened, it had slipped all of our minds, until now. I stared at the glowing green monitor and realized that the microphone was likely the last piece of equipment still submerged. Then it hit me. Why did I just hear Alex call my name? I told myself I was mistaken, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but as I took a step, I heard the voice again. "Stephen," the voice said, its tone distant and hollow. "Stephen, it's cold down here." "This isn't real," I muttered, trying to convince myself. "I know what the temple was built for." Alex's voice now came through the speaker, wet and ragged, like a drowning man struggling for breath. It made me think of someone in their final hours, gasping in the depths of pain and despair.
"Stephen," he wailed. "It won't let me die." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, and for a brief moment, I thought there was nothing on earth that could frighten me more. That was when the door to the pressure chamber creaked open. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, as I struggled to process what I was seeing. The enormous titanium bulkhead, otherwise operable only by hydraulics, had slowly swung open like the door to some ancient mansion. Black water poured out, bubbling forth with a sickening hiss, filling the air with steam and a foul, cloying stench I couldn't name. It was nauseating, a vile mixture of rotting flesh, ammonia, and something indescribably musty. Along with it came strange flotsam, pale strips of unfamiliar plant matter, and what could only be described as unrecognizable biological detritus. The room I was in was large, but by the time I realized my shoes were already soaked and water was rising fast, I barely had time to think. Panic surged in my chest. I turned and ran, my heart hammering, desperate to outrun the water that was quickly flooding the room. The waves lapped at my feet, the current growing stronger, and soon I knew I'd be wading through it knee-deep. Around me, equipment toppled, desks scraped across the floor with a gut-wrenching screech, and computers short-circuited, falling to the ground in sparks. Under different circumstances, I might have broken down in tears over the loss of irreplaceable data and one-of-a-kind equipment. But at that moment, I didn't care. I would sacrifice everything if it meant escaping the madness of this place. The water was rising fast, and I could feel it creeping toward my knees. I pushed forward, my movements frantic, knowing time was running out. The thought of it drove me to move faster, but I hadn't even made it halfway to the door when the light suddenly cut out. Instantly, my foot collided with something unseen, something that shifted beneath my weight. I was sent sprawling forward, completely blind, scrambling in the dark. Despite the water around me, I slammed into the concrete floor, and my wrist twisted painfully as I was flung face first into the rising torrent. The sensation of water closing over my head set off a wave of panic so intense, I briefly wondered if I was already dead, trapped in my own worst nightmare. The panic eventually subsided. Using my good hand, I found some grip on the floor and pushed myself up with a desperate, ragged gasp. Just then, the emergency lights flickered to life, casting the room in a dim, pale glow. The space felt eerily quiet now, its chaos frozen in place. I had been thrown halfway across the room and was farther from the door than I had been before, but at least the water had stopped rising. It was eerily still, and the workstations, once scattered by the current, now rested, motionless, their surfaces littered with discarded equipment or missing entirely, lost beneath the water. Once I was standing, the only sound that remained was the slosh of water and the persistent drip, drip, drip echoing through the stillness. I moved cautiously, terrified that even the smallest movement would draw attention. I lifted one foot and took a hesitant step backward. Nothing shifted above the water, but I had no way of knowing if unseen shapes were already converging on my position, closing in, waiting. I couldn't stop them, and I had no idea how much longer I had to live. The only thing I could do was stick to the plan, move, one step at a time. I managed another 3 steps when one of the desks shifted several inches across the floor. The sound of it scraping against the concrete hit me like a punch to the gut. Something was still moving beneath the water. It didn't help that all manner of debris floated around me, from office furniture to strange, rotting albino plants. Sometimes, something would brush against my bare ankles. I could never be sure if it was alive or just another piece of lifeless detritus drifting aimlessly in the dark. The sound of a door opening behind me sent a jolt of recognition through my chest. The outside world still existed. It had only been 10 minutes since I'd heard Alex's voice, but my mind, so fixated on the horrors surrounding me, had narrowed to the single thought of survival. I had completely forgotten that the power outage would have triggered an alert to others. My mind was so consumed by the fear of whatever shared the water with me that I didn't even turn to greet my rescuers or respond to their frantic calls. Nothing but survival mattered now. It wasn't until I heard the splash of feet moving past me, followed by men rushing past with guns drawn, that I finally looked up. Kim was there, reaching out to touch my shoulder. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern. "Did you open the bulkhead?" I must have looked like a ghost, because when she saw my face, her expression faltered and she froze as if my terror was contagious. "Shut it down," I hissed, teeth clenched in fear. I lifted one leg, continuing my slow, backward shuffle. "Explosives, grenades, anything, just shut it down." "It'll freeze on its own anyway," she replied, her voice surprisingly calm. "The heating rod's turned off. That's probably why it hasn't flooded the room completely." "But why did you open the door?" she asked again, more forcefully. "I didn't open anything," I whispered urgently. "Kim, we're not alone here." "What?" she asked, confusion clouding her face. And then, just as I feared, came the voice. Alex's voice, faint but unmistakable, crackling through the speakers. "He said you aren't alone up there." Kim's eyes went wide with horror, and her breath caught in her throat at the sound of Alex's voice coming through the static. "Fuck this," I muttered, grabbing her hand and pulling her with me as I turned to run the last few meters toward the door. As I did, I heard one of the men inside the room cry out, followed by the sickening sound of a body hitting the floor. I didn't stop to look back, not even when gunfire erupted behind us, the shots ricocheting off the walls and sparking dangerously close to my head. Instead, I forced my feet through the water, the sledge clinging to my boots, dragging Kim with me, my pulse racing as screams echoed in the distance. When we reached the door, I threw both of us out onto the metal walkway. I reached for the door, trying to slam it shut, but the water kept pouring out, resisting my every effort. "Help!" I cried, reaching out to grab Kim, who had slipped and fallen just outside the doorway. "What about the men inside?" she asked, looking back toward the room. At the same moment she asked the question, I glanced inside. The gunfire had stopped, but the chaos was far from over. The sound of struggling, of furniture crashing, and men shouting in terror filled the air. Suddenly, with a sharp crack, one of the men screamed, a blood-curdling wail that made Kim jerk back from the door. She froze, her face turning pale as blood spurted from her eyes. "Shut the fucking door!" she screamed, her voice sharp with panic. Whatever she'd seen had clearly changed her mind, and I was thankful I hadn't witnessed it myself. I didn't hesitate, pushing with all my strength to slam the door shut, Kim joining me with desperate urgency. For a moment, the world outside seemed far away, locked behind a barrier we desperately hoped would hold. "Are you sure it's all done in there?" I asked, my voice a little hoarse. "The water's completely frozen?" Kim nodded without hesitation, her eyes hard, unblinking. We stood near the door to the ground facility, silent, but for the distant hum of the base. It had been 2 days since we'd left the hellish underground, holed up a few hundred meters away in the main base. We had refused to answer any questions from the other scientists, and when anyone dared suggest going back down there, we threatened them with hell. It hadn't made us any friends, but we didn't care. Our evacuation was only an hour away, and we were more than ready to leave that God-forsaken continent behind. But there was still one final job to do. With a grunt of exertion, I wrenched the crowbar into the door's frame, prying it loose. Kim muttered something about how whatever had been down there could have left whenever it wanted to. But I ignored her. I had no idea what that thing was capable of, and for once, I didn't care to know. As long as it had been content to take the men we'd left behind and spare us, I was willing to accept the mystery. To my shame, all I felt was a sense of relief. Then, from somewhere deep within the frozen facility, the voices came. "Stephen, I'm so cold. My mind is falling apart. I can feel bits of myself sloughing off. What are you? I can't see you. Where am I? What was that? Something's coming. Jesus fucking Christ, why won't I die?" Kim froze, her face drained of color, her eyes wide in terror. I knew she'd seen the same look of horror in mine. "You were right," she said, voice barely a whisper. "They're still." I nodded grimly. "I heard them when I came out to check the door the first night." "I don't." "How are they? Are they still down there?" she cried, her voice breaking. "I don't know." I shook my head. "But there'll be a team here soon. They'll find the tunnel frozen over, the facility destroyed, our data centers ruined. But this..." I gestured to the room, the voices echoing from within. "This will demand further investigation." Kim's eyes narrowed and she looked at me, determined. "How can we stop them? Do you have a plan to help them?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I climbed onto a foot of thick ice that had formed over the facility's floor. The emergency lights had failed completely, but the daylight from outside filtered dimly through the cracks in the building. The sight beyond was almost unbearable. The array of corpses scattered in front of me, their heads gone, their bodies frozen in place, yet their voices still crying out in despair. "Their heads," Kim whispered, her voice trembling. "How are they? What is this? I don't understand." "I don't either," I said, my voice low as I moved toward the farthest workstation. The voices were still coming from a fallen speaker, a jumble of agonized pleas and broken cries. "But we can't help them." I paused, staring at the ruin in front of me. The cries, the madness, it was all consuming. For a moment, I almost thought we could save them. But then the harsh truth settled back in. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some random monster or animal. It was intelligent, it was cruel, and it was far older than we could comprehend. Worse still, it had the ability to manipulate the dead, to make them suffer, to drag their souls through an eternity of torment. There was something ancient down there, something we had unwittingly disturbed, and it had to stay buried. With shaking hands, I took out the wire cutters and found the cord leading to the ruined pressure chamber. Even as I prepared to sever it, the voices continued their maddened, twisted chorus. They were still alive, trapped, suspended between life and death. Part of me wanted to believe we could do something to end their suffering. But deep down, I knew the truth. To stop this, we'd have to begin the nightmare all over again. I cut the wire. The voices stopped instantly. Kim stood next to me, her eyes wide with horror, the silence now all-encompassing. "But they're still down there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, just as I was about to lower the cutters, the wire jerked out of my hand. It slipped back into the chamber, disappearing through a tiny pinprick hole in the ice. "And so is something else," I said grimly. I glanced at Kim, who met my gaze with a mixture of fear and understanding. "We keep it that way," I added. "Let's get the hell out of here." This is the very first time I'm speaking about what occurred at the lake. But before I get into the details of that strange and unsettling experience, let me offer a bit of context. This story takes place about 6 years ago, a time when everything seemed simpler and carefree. Back then, I spent a lot of time playing tennis with my parents. Our family was well known at the local courts, which were surrounded by a handful of small villages. In a way, the courts acted as a community hub. Everyone knew everyone. Over the years, I had made a lot of friends, but there was one boy in particular who I became very close with. Let's call him Dan for the sake of this story. Dan and I hit it off almost immediately. We'd often hang out at each other's houses, me at his, him at mine. Our friendship was effortless. We would ride our bikes back and forth between our two villages, and while I lived just down the street from the courts, Dan lived in another village a bit farther away. His mom would drop him off at my house, and mine would drop me off at his. Dan also had a younger brother, Mike, who was just 2 years younger than us, and the three of us would often spend time together. The siblings would squabble, as brothers do, but for the most part, we all got along really well. One day, while we were hanging out, Dan suggested we go fishing. I didn't have much experience with it. I had only gone a few times with my grandfather. But Dan had been fishing for years, so I thought it would be a fun way to spend the day. He had an extra rod I could use, and he knew of a great fishing spot not far from his house. So I borrowed Mike's bike, and the two of us set off on our little adventure. We cycled for about 15 to 25 minutes, the wheels humming against the gravel roads as we made our way to a small farm that sat at the edge of the forest. Dan explained that his grandparents lived in the house, so we decided to stop by for a quick visit before heading to the lake. We parked our bikes and made our way inside, where his grandmother greeted us with a warm smile and a slice of homemade pie. After a pleasant chat, during which I was introduced to Dan's grandparents, we set off again. Dan told me we'd be fishing at a lake hidden deep in the forest, a place few people knew about. As we left the house, his grandfather called out to us from the window, "Remember to respect the fish and the water." Dan gave him a casual thumbs up, signaling he'd heard him, but once we were out of earshot, I asked him what his grandfather had meant by that. Dan shrugged and said it was just his grandfather's way of saying we should respect nature, but that he didn't pay much attention to it. I didn't think much of it either, and continued to follow Dan down the narrow path that led into the woods. After a short walk, we reached the lake. At first glance, it didn't look like much. It was about the size of 1.5 football fields. Nothing spectacular. What struck me as odd, though, was how narrow the shoreline was. It was barely 3 to 4 feet wide before the dense forest closed in, forming an almost impenetrable border around the water. The only way to access the lake was through 2 small human-made paths, which Dan explained were the secret routes that kept most people away. Not many people know about this lake, he told me. It's not even on Google Maps. We made our way to a small bay-like area where rotting pieces of wood stuck out from the water, remnants of a jetty that had long since fallen apart. We set up our rods, and the day unfolded like any good summer day, warm, sunny, and filled with the usual banter between friends. Dan taught me how to properly handle the fishing gear, remove hooks, and all the other little things that come with the sport. The hours passed quickly, and we ended the day with smiles on our faces, already making plans to come back the next day. The next 2 days of fishing were equally uneventful, but there was something about the silence that started to bother me. When we weren't talking, it was as though the lake existed in a world of its own, completely cut off from everything around it. There were no sounds of birds chirping or the rustle of the breeze through the trees. Even the water, which was usually soothing to listen to, was eerily silent. It felt like sound didn't exist in this place. The stillness hung over us like a thick, oppressive blanket, but at the time, I chalked it up to the quiet serenity of being in nature. Looking back, I can't help but feel a deep unease at how normal we thought it was. On the third day, we decided to go all out. We'd have a marathon fishing session, stay the whole day, and camp by the lake. We packed up a tent, plenty of food, drinks, and firewood to keep warm, and set off early in the morning. My mom dropped me off at Dan's house, and we quickly rode our bikes to his grandparents' place. But this time, we didn't stop. We went straight to the lake. When we arrived, the morning fog was thick, hanging low over the water like a ghostly veil. We made our way to the bay area where we had fished before and began setting up our camp. But then, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Out of nowhere, there was a loud splashing sound coming from the lake, like something or someone was thrashing in the water, swimming towards us. We both froze, staring at the lake. It was unlike anything we had heard before. It wasn't the usual calm ripple of water. It was frantic, chaotic. For a brief moment, we both thought maybe it was a dog, but then the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. We looked at each other, unsure of what we had just heard. Dan quickly brushed it off, telling me it was probably just some fish jumping out of the water. We were young and naive, and we convinced ourselves it was nothing to worry about. The rest of the day went by like any other, talking about school, girls, games, and of course, poking fun at each other. But even then, there was a strange feeling that lingered in the air, a sense that something was off, something I couldn't put my finger on. We would never know just how much that day would change everything. As the sun began to set, the mood around the camp shifted. We quickly gathered dry wood and started a fire, the flames crackling and rising high enough to cast a warm glow around us. However, as the fire flickered and settled, a chilling gust of wind swept through the camp. It was sudden, and it sent a shiver down both of our spines, causing goosebumps to appear on my arms. We didn't say anything, but we both felt it. The air had changed. We settled down into our sleeping bags, nestled close to the warmth of the fire. Our fishing rods were standing tall beside us, leaning against the ground near the water's edge. Time passed slowly, and at some point, the sound of the fire and the quiet rustle of the trees must have lulled me to sleep. I woke up with a start, the sound of thrashing water cutting through the night. It was so close, so much louder than before. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, immediately alert, and whispered into the dark, "Did you hear that?" There was no answer. I waited, the silence pressing in around me. 10 seconds passed, then 20. I looked over to my side to check if Dan was still awake, but the spot where he had been lying was empty. My stomach tightened with unease, and I called out to him. "Dan?" No response. "Dan!" I shouted, louder this time, as the first tendrils of panic began to creep into my chest. Still, nothing but the sound of the night. The thrashing continued, drawing closer to the shore, and my fear morphed into something darker, something primal. I jumped to my feet, moving as close to the fire as I could. My eyes were locked on the water, but it was so dark I could hardly make out anything. And then, silence. It was as if the world had swallowed all sound again. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the blackness of the lake. A creeping dread took hold of me. I called Dan's name again, louder this time, but no answer came. I stared at the water, and suddenly, there, just barely visible, was something. A figure. A head, just barely breaking the surface, hovering in the water. I saw only the bridge of the nose, the eyes, and a mess of wet, dark hair. The eyes, those eyes, they were the most unsettling part. They weren't just dark. They were a piercing yellow, glowing faintly in the dark. They seemed to bore into me, deeper and deeper. The rest of the figure was nothing but shadow and abyssal blackness that blended with the water around it. But those eyes, there was something about them that struck me as familiar. Then it hit me, and my blood turned to ice. It was Dan, or at least it looked like him. But there was something horribly wrong about it. This wasn't Dan. Not anymore. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in frantic gasps. I didn't even stop to grab my things. I ran into the woods, away from the lake, away from that thing in the water. The sound of thrashing followed me, but this time it was much more aggressive. It was as though whatever was in the lake was coming for me, determined to drag me down into the depths. I ran blindly through the trees, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder, faster. My only thought was to reach safety. I knew exactly where I needed to go, Dan's grandparents' house. The house that had once felt so warm and comforting now seemed like the only place I could go. I ran for what felt like an eternity, but in reality it couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. When I reached the house, I started pounding on the door, my fists hitting it like a drum, frantic and desperate. I was crying, the tears blurring my vision. My voice cracked as I shouted, "Dan is in the lake!" There was a long pause before the door creaked open. Dan's grandfather stood there, blinking sleepily, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. He looked at me as though I were just another kid, waking him up in the middle of the night for no reason. But when he saw the terror in my eyes, his expression shifted. His eyes widened, his annoyance turning to concern. Without a word, he rushed back inside, and within moments, he came back out with a flashlight and a hunting rifle. "Come on," he said, his voice low and calm, though there was an edge of urgency in it. "Follow me." I trailed behind him as we headed back toward the forest, the world around us feeling impossibly silent in comparison to the chaos I had just left behind. When we reached the spot where we had set up camp, Dan's grandfather stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The campsite, it was gone. But it wasn't just gone, it had decayed. It looked like no one had been there in years. The tent was torn, the fire pit was cold, and everything was covered in a layer of damp leaves and moss. The area looked old, abandoned, like someone had camped there a year ago, not hours ago. I froze, a sick feeling twisted in my gut. Dan's grandfather moved forward, shouting Dan's name, his voice trembling with something I couldn't quite place. He waded into the water, cursing under his breath. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. After what seemed like an eternity, he returned. He had Dan over his shoulder. Dan was unconscious, or at least he appeared to be. His grandfather didn't say a word as he carried him back through the woods, my feet dragging behind them as I followed in a daze. We didn't talk on the way home. When we reached the house, his grandfather laid me down on the couch, urging me to sleep. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Dan will be fine. He just got a cold from the water." But I knew it wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find Dan's grandfather waiting by the door. He didn't mention the events of the previous night. He just drove me home, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. I never saw Dan again after that. Over the years, we drifted apart. We lost contact, and I never spoke of that night to anyone, not even my parents. It felt too surreal, too impossible to comprehend. I still don't know what happened that night or what I saw. But there's one thing I know for sure. Something changed that night. Dan wasn't the same after that. And now, after all this time, I received an email today. The message was short, simple, and chilling. "Do you remember the lake? It's not over. I'm still here."
In early 2012, between the end of January and the middle of February, an unsettling silence surrounded a Russian research expedition in Antarctica. For 16 days, there was no word from them. The team was attempting to reach and study Lake Vostok, a mysterious underground lake lying nearly 4,000 meters beneath the icy surface. This lake had been sealed off from the outside world for over 20,000 years. The expedition began with 8 people, but by the time they were located, only one had survived. She was found near a Norwegian research station, located some 30 kilometers from the presumed entrance to the lake. She was on the brink of death from exposure, terrified, and barely alive. Hours before being rescued, she had broken the silence, whispering only one word: "Help!" Once she was returned, I was assigned the task of interviewing her for our institution. To protect her identity, I will refer to her as Christine, and the names of her colleagues will be altered as well. My office, warm and welcoming, felt like a safe place for her when she arrived. She was escorted by 2 guards, but the moment they left, she seemed to relax, her posture softening. The crackling of the fire seemed to comfort her, though she didn't speak for a long time. My superiors had hoped that, as another woman, I could help her feel more at ease. "Welcome, Madame Ivanova," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "Would you like a warm drink?" Christine nodded, her face pale and strained. I handed her a cup of tea, which she accepted with a trembling hand. "I'm Astrid," I introduced myself. "It's nice to meet you." She gave a small nod, her eyes still filled with suspicion and fear. Yet after a few moments, her shoulders seemed to relax a little. "My name is Christine," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name," I smiled. "How old are you, Christine?" She hesitated before replying, her voice quiet and distant. "I'm 36. "I'm 37. When's your birthday?" I asked, trying to break the tension with a bit of light conversation. After a few minutes of idle chatter to warm her up, Christine began to tell her story. This is a direct transcription of her words, translated freely by me. The 8 of us had been stationed together for almost 3 months before we were assigned the mission to uncover Lake Vostok. So by then, we were pretty familiar with each other, at least within our team. We were divided into 2 groups of 4, working in shifts. The first group consisted of our leader, Dr. Oblonsky, and 3 other older men. One of them was a professional wilderness photographer, and the rest were seasoned scientists. They were all in their mid-50s, I believe. They were polite, but kept to themselves. We rarely saw them or spoke to them. The second group was where I fit in. It was just the 2 women, Anastasia Goncharov and me, along with 2 younger men, Dr. Evan Yahantov and Miroslav.
I felt very lucky to be placed with them. Anastasia was only 29, I think, but she was one of the kindest and most agreeable people I've ever met. Dr. Ivan was around 5 years older than me, funny and openly gay. And Miroslav was handsome and charming. I think in any other environment we would have become close, but the confinement of the station made things inevitable. I liked him, I really did. I think we might have even started dating under normal circumstances. I wouldn't say we were in love, but we definitely had a strong bond. We were great together. We made plans to see each other after we returned home. We lived only 2 hours apart, so we were looking forward to spending more time together. I asked if there were any issues with people in her group. Everyone got along fine, I think. At least, I got along with everyone. Dr. Oblonsky was a good leader. Sometimes, one of the older men from his team would argue with him, but it was always professional. No personal conflicts. We were all there for the same reason, the research. I asked how the team felt about her and Miroslav's relationship. Dr. Ivan was our vice leader, so he knew about us, but he didn't mind. Anastasia knew too, since she was always there with us. Dr. Oblonsky and the rest of the team never found out. We didn't think it was necessary to tell them. Before we left for the expedition, Dr. Oblonsky held a meeting. It was decided that his team would go ahead by a day, since they were the most experienced. You know what that meant. They wanted to make the discovery first and have us as backup, just in case they needed help. But Dr. Ivan agreed without protest. We weren't as important as the others, so we didn't want to make a fuss. "Considering our age," Dr. Ivan said, "I'm sure we'll get other chances." Poor guy. We woke up early on the first day. The others left ahead of us, and we kept in touch with them via radio. The entrance to the lake was in a large cave, and from there we would have to hike 4 kilometers. "We can't find the entrance," Dr. Oblonsky complained on the radio. Half an hour later, he said he felt like he was being watched, and then, miraculously, the entrance appeared right where he had been standing, as if it had just opened by itself. We thought it was just the snow playing tricks on him. Sure, he was experienced, but we all knew this was a first for everyone. Once they entered the cave, we lost radio contact. At first, it wasn't a big deal. We set off the next day at the planned time. It took us longer than expected to find the entrance. We were about to give up and head back when we finally found it. I asked how they eventually located the entrance. It was exactly like Dr. Oblonsky described. The entrance wasn't there, then it felt like we were being watched, and suddenly it just appeared. Like in a story like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Inside the cave, it was so dark and damp that I thought I might pass out. The air smelled strongly of rotten fish, and our flashlights revealed the walls glowing with red, while the icicles inside were unnaturally bright white. The ceiling was perfectly arched, at least 30 meters high, and the ground felt strange, wet and grainy beneath our boots. It was warmer inside than I expected. I mean, it was still cold, around 2 degrees Celsius, but much warmer than outside. Warm caves aren't unheard of, but it was still surprising. "What are the walls made of?" Anastasia asked, curious, running her hand along the surface. As soon as she touched it, it throbbed slightly. The first sign that we weren't alone was a thick rope tied tightly to one of the ice stalagmites. It led down, and we followed it closely. After walking for about an hour, the floor began to change. The grainy texture gave way to something more akin to the ceiling and walls. It looked as if the ground had been sculpted, resembling millions of red bones, each piece contorted and sharp. The moment we stepped onto this new surface, a sound filled the cave. Low, powerful, like the roar of some great beast, or the loudest of yawns. Everything around us trembled. Our feet began sinking into a sticky, light violet substance that seemed to flow upstream, coming from the depths of the cave. I quickly jumped back onto the grainy ground, keeping my distance from the strange liquid, and Anastasia followed me. Miroslav and Dr. Ivan, however, decided to move ahead. The violet ooze quickly darkened, turning into a thick, dark purple sludge that soon enveloped their feet. At first, it only covered their heels, but within seconds, it climbed up their bodies, and they were swallowed whole by the viscous liquid. Anastasia and I stood frozen, horrified, watching as our 2 companions disappeared, swallowed by the ooze. It was almost surreal, like they vanished into thin air. At least it seemed painless, so quick that they probably didn't even have time to realize their bodies were dissolving. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move, mesmerized by the terrifying scene unfolding in front of me. In less than 10 seconds, 2 great people were gone. "We need to go back," Anastasia urged me, her voice filled with panic. We began running toward the cave entrance, but she was leading the way, glancing back every so often to check if I was following. She didn't notice when the stalactites and stalagmites closed in around her like an iron maiden. In a split second, she was gone, impaled by sharp icicles, her blood staining the white, pearly stalactites. There was no doubt in my mind now. I was inside something alive. Worse still, I was trapped between its teeth and its stomach, all alone. The ice stalagmites closed in around Anastasia's body, blocking my way. The only escape left was the rope, tightly tied, stretched over the pool of acid. I realized that the deadly purple river probably hadn't been there when the first team passed through. With a deep breath, I left most of my equipment behind and carefully made my way across the rope like a tightrope walker, knowing that a single misstep would mean certain death. Thank God for my Russian parents and their desire to see me become a ballerina. It's been 20 years since I quit, but my feet were still strong, and I used them to balance as I crossed the rope, with the purple river swirling beneath me. As I continued, the ground, the beast's throat, gradually lowered. Eventually, I could hold the rope with my hands above my head, which made things easier. I didn't know if I had a reason to live, but I couldn't help myself. I was a scientist. All I could think about was surviving so I could tell the world what I'd discovered. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the rope. From there, I walked. God knows how long, using my knowledge of anatomy to navigate around the pools of acid. I started noticing strange green lumps floating in the gastric juice. Some were small, but others were enormous, clearly undigested matter. Is it too far-fetched if I tell you that I jumped into one of them and used it as a sort of boat? Well, maybe it sounds unbelievable, but after everything I'd been through, it seemed entirely possible. That's how I survived, floating through the beast's digestive system. When I got hungry, I ate pieces of my boat. There was nothing else, so I had to, and it didn't kill me, so I kept eating small chunks to stay alive. I have no idea what it was, but it kept me alive, or at least as well as I could be in such a hellish place. I slept and relieved myself there in my makeshift boat, until the stench of my own waste overpowered even the smell of rotting fish. I slept 3 times before I found the rest of my crew, which meant they had survived longer than my original group. From what I could gather, based on the size of the beast's mouth, I must have been near the end of its stomach, heading for the first intestine, when I found Dr. Oblonsky and the others. They were preserved inside some sort of amber-like substance, their faces frozen in terror. They had been alive for a long time inside the creature before dying. Perhaps they were still alive when I passed them by. I couldn't save anyone. All I could do was keep moving forward. The 2 others were pressed against the walls of the creature's stomach, like a fat mosquito squashed against a window. The light violet liquid from above dripped steadily, slowly digesting them. Their deaths made something clear to me. I wasn't dealing with an ordinary beast. The substance that had preserved Dr. Oblonsky must have been part of a massive structure that had crushed the other 2. This realization hit me just a second before something monstrous occurred. Tentacle-like membranes descended from small crevices in the ceiling, undulating as though they could sense life. In that instant, I did the only thing I could think of to survive. I lay flat on my stomach on the boat, covering myself in the foul-smelling feces surrounding me. It was the worst decision I'd made, but it worked. I hid my scent, avoiding the membranes and preventing myself from being preserved in some eternal, unreachable scream. As I drifted toward what I hoped was the intestines, the acidic sea turned into something unexpected, a calm, ethereal blue. The liquid became crystal clear, and the usual strange whirring sound was replaced by a peaceful, all-consuming quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, I relaxed. I believed, for a brief moment, that I had arrived at Lake Vostok. The lake, known for its ancient mysteries, seemed to stretch out before me in serene beauty. Around its edges, I saw creatures trapped in amber, strange life forms suspended in time. There were things that looked like algae and jellyfish, horseshoe crabs, sponges, shrimps, sturgeons, sharks, seals, eerie, ancient creatures. And then a row of rabbits and frogs, odd penguins, giant butterflies, a primitive man, a bear, and even 3 mammoths, all perfectly preserved in their last moments. One figure caught my eye, a humanoid figure over 4 meters tall, curled in a fetal position. As I traveled along the lake, I entered strange chambers where the liquid beneath was filled with bizarre fossils. Some of these beings had 20 eyes, others 3 legs and 8 heads. Some were made of tongues, some had brains with long limbs, and some were simply impossible to describe. They twitched and blinked, their eyes following me, as if they were alive but dormant. The creature's mouth, esophagus, and stomach had been dark, foreboding, but here, in the duodenum, there was a mystical polar blue light. The ceiling was filled with beautiful salt crystals, reflecting the light in a kaleidoscope of colors. It was like being in the womb of creation, the very beginning of life on Earth, the birthplace of things that have existed and things yet to come. I was both horrified and captivated by its beauty. I wished desperately that I had a camera to capture this, but I'd traveled light for the rope, keeping only my clothes, flashlight, and a small radio in case I ever made it out. The cameras we had were too bulky, and phones were useless here. After what seemed like an eternity, my boat entered what I believed to be the giant's jejunum. The light faded once again, and the surroundings turned dark and oppressive. Gone was the vast lake. Now I sailed through a narrow, murky stream, its waters thick and foreboding. At this point, everything becomes hazy. I can't remember clearly, but it felt as though the creature wanted me to leave its body. Maybe it thought, now that this thing has gotten so far, I'll let it go. It was as though the monster had made up its mind to let me out. It felt almost as though it had a purpose in letting me reach this point, but the journey through its ilium was horrible, indescribable. Finally, being expelled by the monster was an experience beyond words. I lost my boat, and for a moment, I thought I was going to suffocate in the black mud that coated me. But instead, the warmth of light began to appear ahead, as I was cast out into the snow. The mud melted in contact with the freezing snow, and I radioed for help, my voice weak and barely audible. Then, exhaustion overtook me, and I passed out in the middle of a blinding snowstorm. When I woke up, the first thought that crossed my mind was a bitter laugh. After everything I've been through, I'm going to die of hypothermia now? I stumbled toward what I thought might be a structure in the distance. My body numb, my mind foggy. The rest, as you know, is history. The Norwegians found me and saved my life. In my report, I made sure to emphasize that Christine Ivanova appeared lucid and intelligent. If her story had been fabricated, she certainly wasn't doing it for attention. She truly believed what she was telling me. Physically, however, she looked a wreck. Her appearance was pitiful, but after 16 days of being lost, malnourished, and sedated with tranquilizers, it was understandable. Yet my superiors dismissed her account entirely. They considered it to be nothing more than the delusions of a traumatized survivor. They never sent her back to my office. I didn't see Christine again, but I heard rumors that she died a year after our interview. For years, I carried on with my life. As a psychiatrist working for a governmental agency, I interviewed other individuals who had been lost or had experienced similar horrors. Some stories almost as bizarre as hers. I nearly forgot about her. Until recently. Lately, I've been feeling unwell all the time. My skin has a faint purple hue, and these strange lumps have started appearing under the surface. They're solid, painless, but unnerving. No doctor I've seen can offer a conclusive diagnosis. I try not to overthink it, but they look like tiny eyes, just like the ones Christine described. On a whim, I decided to look up people who had been in contact with her back then. The Norwegians, the guards, even my former boss. To my horror, everyone who was close to her is either sick or dead. Terrified for my own safety, I broke protocol and snuck into a restricted room to check her file. I told myself I just needed to review what we discussed, looking for some clue to the cause of my illness. Her file had been updated a year after our conversation, with a photograph attached. Christine's corpse. And the final note, Christine had 20 eyes, and her limbs had transformed into tongues. I'm a park ranger, stationed in a remote county park. My territory spans a vast lake and an even larger campground. My job includes enforcing rules, patrolling the water, and occasionally helping campers who can't tell the difference between a 30 and a 50-amp plug. To be honest, the park isn't much to look at. It's just an endless stretch of dusty scrubland dotted with eucalyptus trees and surrounded by barren hills. The only real draw is the man-made lake, 5,000 acres of murky water perfect for swimming, fishing, and boating. But don't let anyone catch me in that water. One year, they drained part of it and discovered a 3-foot-deep layer of human waste at the bottom. And listen, I've been a cop before. I've smelled dead bodies in the summer heat and walked through hoarder houses full of decomposing animals. But that lake? The stench of that massive underwater filth baking in the July sun tops them all. But there's a reason the campground is always staffed with rangers. It's a massive park, isolated and surrounded by rough land. We get plenty of vagrants and meth labs, and let's face it, when you pack hundreds of drunk campers into tight quarters near water, trouble's bound to follow. Drownings, fires, boat accidents, you name it. Sometimes, it's worse than that. People end up dead. Limbs washing up on shore like forgotten trash. A reminder of accidents and suicides. And every summer, without fail, some gangbanger shoots another, and it ruins the peace for everyone. Yet they still come. Every year. Park rules say the lake is off limits from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. No swimming, no boats, no exceptions. So when a camper called in a complaint about some rogue boater breaking the rules at midnight on July 26th, I was on it. Walking out of the air-conditioned ranger station into the suffocating heat felt like stepping into a wall of thick, damp wool. The air was heavy, thick with warmth and weight. It pressed against me, so dense it was almost hard to breathe, and every step felt like slogging through water. The faint red and purple glows of the night shimmered at the edge of my vision, teasing my senses. Out on the water, though, it was a little better. Still hot, but thinner, less oppressive. Easier to breathe. I maneuvered the patrol boat past the dock and started a slow perimeter search. The lake's nearly 8 square miles, and the boat was old. A clunky thing that had been floating along for years. I shut the engine off at intervals, listening for the telltale rumble of an illegal boat motor. Nothing. Just the soft lapping sound of the water and the whisper of wind. The lake has a few man-made islands scattered throughout. Nothing impressive, just mounds of dirt covering access points to the infrastructure. When the perimeter search came up empty, I decided to check out these islands. I steered the boat close to the biggest island, cut the engine, and drifted silently. Out here, far from the campsites and the fires, the air was almost bearable. I looked up without thinking. The sky stretched wide, filled with stars, pale and quiet against the velvet blackness. The Big Dipper caught my eye, and I couldn't help but smile. If only I could fly, I thought, float up into the clouds and drift silently under the starlight. I shook myself and scanned the island. Nothing but rocks, scattered litter, and dry vegetation that cast long, eerie shadows. Another sigh escaped me, and I resumed my search. The longer I stared into the island's darkness, the more it seemed to blend into the night. When the shadows were thick enough to obscure everything, I sighed once more and turned off the engine. I gazed up at the sky again, and my frown deepened. The stars had changed. In the early hours, the stars are sharp, cold, remote, but these were different. Warm and strange, glowing in shades of yellow, gold, sickly green, and dull, unsettling red. I don't know much about constellations, but the Big Dipper's always been a landmark for me. I had just seen it, but now it was gone. In its place, the sky was alive with swirling flower-like patterns, as though fireworks had been detonated far above and then frozen in place, suspended in the dark. A creeping chill slid down my spine. I turned around quickly, suddenly aware that my heart was hammering in my chest. And that's when I saw it. A boat. A rush of mixed emotions hit me, relief, irritation. I steered my boat closer, flipping on every light I had. The harsh white beam cut through the night, revealing two figures in a motorboat, a little boy and an elderly man. My stomach sank. The man had a terrible facial injury. One of his eyes drooped low, sagging past where his cheekbone should have been. His head was too small, too uneven, and there were 4 pink scars running across his face. They bubbled strangely, like old, healing wounds. On the floor of the boat, several black garbage bags were crumpled together, with an open tackle box placed on top of them. "Are you kidding me?" I barked, my voice tight with annoyance. "You seen the rules? Nobody's supposed to be on the water after 10 p.m. It's 2 in the goddamn morning. What do you think you're doing?" "Night fishing," the boy mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The man stood up slowly, his movements stiff. "I didn't know, officer. I thought I'd take him out, on the water. We don't like the daylight. People stare." "Makes it hard for me," he said with a thin, sad smile. His grin was uncomfortable, disturbing. Yet there was something almost heartbreaking about it. A father and son, trying to hold on to some semblance of normality in a world that clearly didn't care for them.
I was ready to write them up, to hit them with the highest fine I could impose, but the reality of it hit me hard. A father and son just trying to make memories together. I couldn't bring myself to punish them. "I understand. I do," I said, my voice softening. "But there are rules. People are trying to sleep. I'll let you off this time, but I'm escorting you back to shore." The man exchanged a strange, silent glance with the boy. Then he nodded, his thin, weary smile returning. "Okay, thank you, officer. Thank you." He turned away, but as he did, his coat flared open, revealing something I wasn't expecting. A sheriff's uniform. A golden star glimmered on his chest. I blinked, and suddenly, the coat was closed again, hiding the badge and the uniform beneath it. Before I could react, the boy did something strange. He leaned over the edge of the boat, slipping something into the water. It landed with a sharp plop. "What was that?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Do you need help fishing it out?" The boy's face turned white, and he shook his head rapidly. No. It was just nothing." I swung the flashlight toward the water, my heart thumping. That's when I saw it, something long, ragged, and pale drifting below the surface. Blood clouded behind it like watercolor, spreading out into the dark water. A human arm. My hand shot to my duty belt, my voice cold as steel. "Stay where you are. Don't move." At that moment, something massive and white erupted from the murk, slithering along the side of the motorboat. It was like an enormous ribbon of moonlight, cutting through the water with a ghostly grace. I watched, paralyzed, as the ribbon of light wrapped around the arm, drawing it in, and began to consume. "What the hell is that?" I barely recognized my own voice, thick with disbelief. "What are you people doing?" The man licked his lips nervously, his attempt at a smile trembling. "It defies nature, as we know it. If we feed it, it stays small. If we don't, it grows." He shuddered, visibly trembling. His coat fluttered from the intensity of it. We can't let it grow anymore. It's already pulling the other world through to ours, like thread through a needle. When it gets enough thread, it'll start stitching. I stared up at the sky, my breath caught in my throat. The constellations were pulsing, strange and warm, in 1,000 colors I'd never seen. Then, that long, eerie ribbon lashed out at my boat, striking with such force that I nearly lost my balance. I crashed against the railing as the creature emerged. "Don't look," the man screamed in horror. But it was too late. I saw it, a face, predatory yet formless, hollow, dark eyes, a gaping maw filled with lights like pulsing stars drifting in and out of focus. The air around it seemed to vibrate with some otherworldly hum.
I shut my eyes tight, praying as the boat creaked, the water lapping at the hull like whispers in the dark. For what felt like an eternity, the boat rocked gently in the silence, and then in a small, timid voice, the boy murmured, "It's full. We can go now." I didn't need any more encouragement. Halfway across the lake, I heard the distant rumble of a motor, and when I glanced back, I saw the man and the boy in their little boat, trailing behind me. The man smiled faintly, an expression that was both encouraging and unsettling. I turned away quickly, shivering from head to toe. My heart hammered so violently in my chest that it made me feel sick. And then, almost as if on reflex, I looked up at the sky. The stars were back to normal, pale, cold, familiar. The Big Dipper hung in the sky like an old friend. I breathed a sigh of relief, and as I neared the shore, I told myself it had all been a nightmare. A hallucination brought on by too much stress. Maybe I was sick, too sick to be a ranger, too ill to keep this job. But then, a few days later, something happened that I couldn't shake from my mind. On July 28th, a little girl found a leg on the shore of the lake. No one knows where it came from. The rumors are flying. Some say it was a suicide. Others think it belongs to a girl who's been missing for a few months. The most popular theory is that it was some tragic accident. The authorities aren't going to drain the lake. They claim it's impossible. 5,000 acres is too much to search, not even for a potential murder. But here's the thing. They drained the lake before. Just a while ago, they emptied it to clean up some waste. They can drain it if they want to. But maybe they know better than to try. The following weekend, I made my way back to the house, ready to start the project. The sun was shining, and there was a light breeze across the lake that made the trees sway gently. It was peaceful out there, just as it always had been. The kind of tranquility that comes with being surrounded by nature and the memories of a simpler time. I pulled up to the old, weather-beaten house and unloaded the tools and materials I'd gathered. The plans were tucked under my arm, and the faint scent of sawdust and old wood filled the air. I spread out the blueprints on the workbench again, measuring and checking the dimensions once more before heading down to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky above. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, feeling a sense of connection to the place. My grandfather's legacy was in the land, the house, the lake, and now, in this final project, I was determined to finish it for him. It was a way to honor the countless summers we spent out here together. As I moved along, measuring the depth of the water with my new gauge, something strange caught my eye. At the very edge of the lake, where the water met the mud, there was something I hadn't noticed before. A subtle, dark spot in the otherwise clear, shallow water. I bent down, squinting to get a better look, but I couldn't make out what it was. It was too far out, and the water was too murky in that spot. It nagged at me, like a distant memory I couldn't quite place. I figured it was probably just some old debris or a sunken log. There was a lot of that around the lake, especially after all the years. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. I decided to push it aside and continued with the task at hand. The dock was going to be a big project, but I was determined to get it right. I spent the whole weekend working, getting the first few posts set up, the framework taking shape. The sun set, and I stayed out there well into the evening, working by the light of a lantern. It was hard work, but somehow satisfying. The next week, I went back to the house, but as I was setting up for the day, something made me pause. The water near the shore seemed different. The strange dark spot I'd noticed was still there, but now it looked larger, like something had shifted underneath, pushing the mud up toward the surface. At first I thought maybe it was just a natural phenomenon, A shifting of the lake bed, maybe caused by the weight of the dock posts I'd already set. But then I realized the water wasn't just muddy. It was moving, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. The feeling I'd had the previous week returned, sharper now, like a cold shiver running down my spine. I couldn't help myself. I waded into the shallow water, walking toward the dark spot. It was oddly calm out, no wind, no movement, yet the water seemed to ripple, as if something large was below. I reached the spot and bent down again, feeling my heart start to race. There, hidden just below the surface, was something large. A shape, perhaps a body, partially buried in the mud. My breath caught in my throat. The shape was unmistakable now, like an old, weathered trunk, but there was something about the edges of it, too smooth, too uniform for nature. I reached down, my hand trembling, and touched it. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, the shape moved. The water surged, pulling away from the object, and for a split second, I thought I saw something dark and elongated beneath the surface, its edges sharp and unnatural. I jerked my hand back, heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? I backed away from the water, quickly getting to my feet. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Why hadn't I noticed this before? What had changed in the lake? I felt a chill creeping up my spine, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The calmness of the lake, the peacefulness I had known all my life, felt wrong, as if the very land beneath me was hiding something I was never meant to find. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the ripples slowly fading back into stillness. Something was down there, something that shouldn't be. But it was too late to stop now. With my heart still racing, I forced myself to turn away and continue the project. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't ignore it. My grandfather had loved this place, and so had I. There had to be an explanation, something logical, something grounded in reality. But as the day stretched on and the sun began to set again, the feeling of unease stayed with me. Whatever was in that lake, whatever had been there all along, was watching. And now I was part of its story. The following weekend, I returned to the house, borrowing a friend's pickup truck to haul everything I needed in one go. I packed up some food, water, and a few other essentials. It would make things a lot easier if I just stayed out there for a few days without having to keep driving back to town. Luckily, enough of my grandfather's old furniture was still around to make shorter stays relatively comfortable. The first thing on my list was to get the depth measurements I needed. I dragged the old rowboat out from the overgrown shore, praying it would stay afloat long enough for me to get the readings. The depth meter I'd bought seemed simple enough, just a small device that looked like a flashlight. You were supposed to submerge it into the water, and it would use a laser to calculate the distance to the lake bed. Pretty cool, right? The wonders of modern technology. I was relieved to find that the boat still floated and didn't seem to have any major leaks. I hopped aboard and paddled out about 30 feet from shore to where I'd planned to place the end of the dock. I uncapped the depth meter, stuck it in the water, and flipped the switch, but nothing happened. The display on the side just kept flashing "reading" for what felt like an unusually long time. After a minute or so, the message changed to "error" and it shut off. I tried again and again, but the result was the same. The damn thing wasn't working. The wonders of modern technology, indeed. So I headed back to the hardware store. Fortunately, there was a smaller one closer to the house, so I didn't have to drive all the way back into town. I picked up an older, more straightforward model, a weight on the end of a line, like a glorified tape measure. Once the weight hit the bottom, you could just read the measurements right off the line. It was simple, reliable, and probably exactly what I should have gotten in the first place. Once I was back at the house, I set out on the lake again. I tossed the weight overboard and let it sink. But something strange happened. The line kept unwinding, fast. It didn't stop at 15 feet or 30 feet like I expected. It just kept going, deeper and deeper. 50 feet, 75 feet, I couldn't believe my eyes. The line kept pulling out, and I had no idea how far it would go. Finally, it stopped at 100 feet, but only because that was as far as the line would let me go. It hadn't touched the bottom. I had to be wrong. I had never felt the bottom, but I knew the lake couldn't be that deep. Could it? I spent a few minutes reeling the line back in, confused. Maybe it was just a fluke, I thought. Maybe the line had gotten tangled or something. I tried again, tossing the weight into the water and watching as it unspooled. But sure enough, it stopped again when there was no more line left to give. I just stood there for a while, scratching my head, not sure what to make of it. Should I get a longer line? Would that even help? If the water was that deep, there was no way I could use posts for the dock. What was I supposed to do? In my frustration, the depth meter slipped from my hands and fell into the water. It disappeared immediately, pulled down by the weight on the end of the line. Great, I thought, just another $30 down the drain. I sat there in the boat for a while, doing some quick searches on my phone, trying to find a solution. I didn't get far before the boat suddenly lurched. The jolt threw me off balance, and I nearly lost my paddle over the side. I could see the ripples spreading across the water, though the wind had died down completely. The water was unnaturally still. Before I could process what had happened, a loud splash erupted from the side of the boat. I jumped, barely managing to shield my head as something shot up from the water, so fast I could barely see it. It fell back down with a heavy thunk, landing between my legs in the bottom of the boat. I froze, wide-eyed, as I looked down. There, in the bottom of the boat, was the metal weight from the depth meter, still attached to a few feet of line. The line looked torn, shredded at the end, as though something had ripped it apart. My heart hammered in my chest. I rowed back to shore as fast as I could, panic rising with every stroke. I felt the water moving under me, swirling, pulling in ways that didn't make sense. I paddled harder, faster, my muscles burning, but all I could think about was what had just happened. The boat felt like it was being dragged into the water, despite my best efforts. When I finally made it to the shore, I crawled out of the boat, panting, and stumbled away from the lake. I couldn't bring myself to look back, but I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I caught my breath. What had that been? What the hell was in the water? Inside the house, I dried off as best I could, then changed into my pajamas. I sat by the back door, staring out at the lake, but I didn't feel comforted by its familiar, peaceful appearance anymore. It looked normal, calm, glassy, the evening sun reflecting off the water, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Part of me wanted to just leave, to jump in the truck and drive away from this place, but I couldn't. Not yet. All I could do was sit there, watching the lake, waiting for something else to happen. Every time a dragonfly skimmed the surface or a frog croaked from the shoreline, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Rational thoughts of doubt crept in. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a freak accident. But each time those thoughts popped up, I would look at the mangled line on the kitchen counter, and I would look back out at the lake. It didn't make sense, but I knew what I'd seen. Hours passed, and soon my eyes grew heavy. I fought sleep, but in the end my exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a fitful slumber. The dreams were strange, vivid, dreams I wouldn't want to remember. They were the kind that left you with a cold sweat in the middle of the night. I woke suddenly, gasping for air, almost falling out of the chair I had been using as a lookout. Disoriented, I looked out the window, my heart still racing. The lake was still there, still calm, but I didn't feel reassured. I felt watched, nothing, just the moonlight reflecting on a calm patch of water. The stillness of it all almost made me doubt what I had seen earlier. Maybe it had been some kind of large, deep water creature? A crocodile, perhaps? Were those even a thing here? I glanced back at the broken depth meter, as if it held the answers to everything that had happened, but it didn't. And as I stared at it one more time, the light from outside grew even brighter. At first it was subtle, like the moon slipping out from behind a cloud, but the light grew, expanding in intensity. I turned back toward the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I saw it. The lake was glowing. An ethereal blue-green light shimmered across the surface, ripples appearing out of nowhere, expanding outward from the center. At first the ripples came only once every minute or so, but gradually they grew faster, more erratic. And with them, a low hum filled the air, a sound I could feel deep in my bones, accompanied by an uncomfortable pressure like descending in an airplane. I tried to run. I reached for my car keys, my hand shaking, desperate to leave. but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like my body was frozen, trapped in some invisible grip. The lake began to rise, rising unnaturally, like a giant bubble pushing up from below, lifting the water higher and higher, creating a massive dome. The water pulsed, glowing with that otherworldly light. It was taller than the house now, towering over the trees surrounding it. Suddenly, I felt myself stand up. My legs moved of their own accord, leading me toward the back door, toward the lake. I didn't have control anymore. My feet moved across the grass, and cool mist sprayed against my skin. I couldn't blink, couldn't stop myself. The dome of water continued to rise, and the light inside it began to flicker, flashing violently, like a storm trapped within. In the flashes, I saw something. A shape, massive, easily 50 feet across, coiled in on itself like a seashell or a hurricane. But it wasn't the shape that terrified me. It was the tendrils, dozens of them, reaching out, twitching like the tail of a cat, waiting for something. The light at the center of the dome pulsed brighter, and I felt like it was focusing on me, zeroing in on my every movement. I couldn't scream. I couldn't speak. It felt like my voice was stuck in my throat, but the voice in my head was louder than any thought of my own. It echoed, louder than anything, louder than fear. "Come in," it said. "He's already here. I've seen you in his memories." I kept walking. I was no longer in control. I reached out, my fingers trembling. I knew what I had to do. I embraced it, the inevitable. Whatever it was, I was being pulled toward it. And then I was somewhere else. I was sitting in a house I didn't recognize. A neighbor's house, I would later learn. He was the one who found me, wandering in the woods, soaked to the bone, still wearing my pajamas. He said it reminded him of when he had found my grandpa years ago. A strange déjà vu, like he had seen this happen before. My mom showed up to take me home an hour or so later. I couldn't read her face. There was no comfort there, no relief. She didn't say much on the drive back to her house. We just sat in silence. The next few weeks were a blur of scans, tests, doctors, and specialists. I barely paid attention to any of it. The results were always the same. Nothing wrong. They had to run more tests. I could almost laugh at it, but I knew my mom didn't see any humor in it. And I was getting worse. Slowly, but surely. My mind felt clouded, like I was stuck in some sort of waking dream. My thoughts didn't feel like my own. I was forgetting things, little things, at first, but they were starting to add up. Even my memories of my grandpa were fading, becoming more distant. I could still feel the warmth of those memories, but the details were slipping through my fingers, becoming harder to grasp. So I decided to write it all down. I had to, before it disappeared completely, before I forgot everything. I don't know what was out there in that lake, but I know it wasn't just in my head. My mom says she's selling the house. She doesn't want me going anywhere without her, not until I'm better, she says. But somehow, deep down, I know I'll be back. The lake will call me back. On average, 16 people drown each year in the lake of the Ozarks, Missouri. The majority of these victims are never recovered. Local authorities often attribute the disappearances to strong underwater currents, the lake's notorious lack of water clarity, and the presence of wildlife that could disturb or disorient divers. But after what I experienced last winter, I've come to believe something much more sinister is at play beneath the surface. Last year, my parents purchased a new construction condominium at the Lake of the Ozarks. At the time, they were the only residents, as the other units were still being built and sold. The place was perfect. Spacious, modern, and quiet. A far cry from my rundown college house. It was only an hour and a half from my campus, making it the ideal escape for a weekend of peace and focused studying before finals. For someone like me, overwhelmed by the constant noise of college life, it felt like paradise. The condo had a king-size bed, a full kitchen, pristine bathrooms, and, most importantly, no distractions. It was early December when I packed up my old Mustang with a pile of dirty laundry, textbooks, and notes. Finals were looming, but I needed a retreat before the madness began. Normally, one or two of my housemates would join me on these trips, but this time, they had already finished their exams and planned to spend the last few days partying before heading home for the holidays. This worked out perfectly for me. I would have the condo to myself for the weekend. The engine of my Mustang roared to life as I turned the key, a sound that made me smile. It was late, but I was too excited about the prospect of a quiet weekend to care. The night air was crisp and the highway was empty as I made my way toward the lake. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, but tonight it felt different. The low hum of my engine and the chilly December air made the journey feel more thrilling than usual. After about an hour, I turned off the main highway and took the back roads toward the lake, a stretch of winding, unlit paths that cut through dense forests and dark hills. My headlights illuminated the lonely road as I sped up, the wind rushing through the cracked windows, howling past my ears. I could feel the anticipation building. This weekend would be exactly what I needed to relax, get some studying done, and recharge. If I had known what awaited me, I would have turned around and driven straight back to campus without a second thought. But it was too late to turn back now. A few minutes later, I saw the faint, aqua-colored glow of the Blue Shore condominium sign cutting through the darkness. The sign flickered briefly before staying lit, its pale light casting eerie reflections across the otherwise pitch-black landscape. I shifted gears, heading down the steep, hilly entrance, my headlights the only source of illumination for miles.
Just as I expected, the condominium parking lot was completely empty. Not a single car was parked, not a single light in any of the other units was on. The place felt desolate, as if the rest of the world had forgotten it existed. I pulled into the front spot, killed the engine, and stepped out of my car. The cold hit me like a slap, the night air biting at my skin. The temperature had plummeted, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me as I locked the car behind me. The two-story complex, which would eventually house 10 units, 5 on each level, looked just as new and barren as it did when I'd first visited. My parents' unit, number 21, was on the top floor, the corner unit with only one neighboring wall. I scaled the steps quickly, eager to get inside and out of the cold. The silence of the night was suffocating, as if the whole world had been muffled. When I reached the door, I pulled out my phone and used the dim screen to illuminate the keypad. I typed in the code, my birth year, something my parents thought I would never forget. They were probably right. I had memorized it since I was a child. The door clicked open, and I stepped inside. The warmth of the condo was immediate, a stark contrast to the cold, biting air outside. I flicked on the lights and was greeted by the familiar layout, an open dining area, with the kitchen to the left and the living room to the right. At the far end of the room was the master bedroom, which had a large window with a breathtaking view of the lake. From this vantage point, I could see the dark water stretching out for nearly half a mile, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. The sight was serene, but also unsettling, as if the water held secrets I wasn't ready to know. I quickly made a frozen pizza and sat down at the dining table, trying to get some studying done for my finals. But the exhaustion from the week soon caught up with me. After only a couple of hours, my eyelids grew heavy, and I decided to take a shower before heading to bed early. I promised myself I would wake up early the next day and hit the books hard. But as I stood under the warm water, my thoughts drifted, and the weight of the week began to settle on me. I was ready for rest. The shower didn't take long, and soon I was in my pajamas, sitting by the back door with a book in my lap that I wasn't really reading. I stared out at the lake, the black expanse of water reflecting the moonlight. I tried to shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet, too still. But eventually, the exhaustion won out. I set the book aside and made my way to the bedroom. As I lay in the king-sized bed, I tried to clear my mind of everything. The stress of finals, the worries of life, the warmth of the blankets cocooned me, and before long, I was asleep. But the lake was still awake.
I jolted awake in the middle of the night, my heart hammering against my chest. I glanced at the bedside clock. 3:18 a.m. The cold wind howled outside, the sound of ice and snow scraping against the siding of the condo. I had completely forgotten to check the weather before leaving campus, but now I could feel it. Winter's sharp bite had descended. I rubbed my eyes and sluggishly dragged myself to the kitchen for a glass of water, hoping to shake off the unease gnawing at my gut. I drank slowly, savoring the cold relief as the water trickled down my throat. Standing there in the dark, I felt off. Something about the silence felt wrong. I turned to head back to the bedroom, but then I heard it. An unmistakable sound that made my blood run cold. The cracking of ice, followed by the echoing splash of water from the lake. My first instinct was to brush it off. Maybe it was the ice shifting on the surface, or perhaps a deer had wandered down to the shore and fallen in. But as I stood there, staring out into the blackness, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't that simple. No, something had happened. Something strange. My curiosity got the best of me the next morning. Despite the growing sense of unease gnawing at me, I pulled on my coat and stepped outside into the biting cold. I pulled the door shut behind me, the locking mechanism clicking with an almost unnatural finality. I took a deep breath, steeling myself before heading to the top of the stairs. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks. There, leading from the edge of the lake to my car, were footprints. They were bipedal, human, or at least they looked human. The prints were deep and fresh, the snow around them still crisp and undisturbed. But then, they turned. And without any clear explanation, they led right back to the lake's edge, vanishing into the dark water. My mind raced. It didn't make sense. The prints hadn't come from the direction of the house. There had been no sign of anyone walking up from the road. No vehicle had passed by during the night. And why did they stop at the lake? No one in their right mind would wade into the freezing water this time of year. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around and get back inside. The quietness of the air felt oppressive, thick with a sense of foreboding. The only sound was the crunching of my boots in the snow, but it felt like there was something watching me, following me. I turned quickly, looking over my shoulder every few steps. When I reached the dock, I fumbled with my phone, hoping for a signal. After what felt like an eternity, one bar appeared. I dialed 911, my fingers shaking. I pressed the phone to my ear, desperate for someone to answer. But the signal was too weak, the call didn't connect. I swore under my breath and cursed the isolation of the place. The only thing left to do was go back inside. I trudged back up the stairs and into the warmth of the condo. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, and for some reason it felt colder inside than it had outside. I stared out the window, my thoughts spinning. Had someone really been in the water last night? The idea was absurd, yet it gnawed at the back of my mind, refusing to let go. I spent the rest of the day pacing the condo, unable to shake the overwhelming paranoia that had settled over me. I tried calling again, but the signal was no better. I kept thinking about the footprints. Who had made them, and why had they led into the lake and then disappeared? That night, I couldn't bring myself to go to bed early. The fear that something was out there, something waiting, kept me awake. I drank a little more than usual to try to numb the anxiety, and before I knew it, I felt drowsy, the alcohol making my eyelids heavy. 3:09 a.m. The sound that tore me from my sleep was unmistakable. Scraping. The metal door of the condo screeched as if something or someone was dragging something heavy across it. My heart skipped a beat and I shot out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I rushed to the kitchen and grabbed the first thing I could find, an old kitchen knife. Nothing more than a dull blade, but it felt like all I had at that moment. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the door, knife gripped tightly in my hand. Every sound seemed amplified, the beating of my heart thumping in my ears. The scraping continued for what felt like hours, and I fought the urge to run and hide. Slowly, I gathered the courage to peek through the peephole. My breath caught in my throat as I saw nothing but the empty darkness outside. No one was there. The scraping stopped, leaving behind only silence. I stayed there, pressed against the door, clutching the knife in trembling hands. The minutes dragged on until the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. I didn't dare open the door until I had checked the peephole one last time. The fear I felt in that moment was primal, but I couldn't let it control me. Slowly, cautiously, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The sight that greeted me sent a chill through my bones. The snow around the door was disturbed. But what I hadn't noticed before was the deep, long scratches running the entire length of the door. They were fresh, jagged marks as if something or someone had been desperately trying to claw their way inside. My pulse quickened. I didn't know what to do. My rear-wheel drive car sat at the top of a snow-covered hill, and there was no way I could make it down without getting stuck. I was trapped, completely isolated, and with no phone signal to reach anyone, I was on my own. I spent the rest of the day in the condo, pacing, checking the windows, and trying my best to ignore the creeping sense of dread that clung to me. I needed to do something, anything, to break free of this nightmare, but the hours stretched on, and the fear only deepened. By evening, I had worked up enough courage. I knew there was a place I might get a signal, a spot at the end of the dock. It had worked before. It had to work now. As I made my way to the dock, the cold air biting at my skin, I followed the trail of footprints, which once again led to the lake shore. My boots crunched through the snow, and I felt a chill seep deeper into my bones with every step. When I reached the edge of the dock, I crouched down to examine the prints more closely. They were unmistakably human, but there was something horribly wrong about them. The edges were too uneven, too jagged, and despite the cold that had gripped the area, they reeked of lake water and something else. Something putrid, something that spoke of decay, rot, and death. The scent filled the air, making my stomach twist. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to shake off the paralyzing sense of dread that had crept up my spine. With one last, reluctant glance at the lake's dark expanse, I pulled out my phone. Of course, there was still no signal. I cursed under my breath and turned away, deciding to retreat to the condo before the light completely faded. The sinking feeling in my chest told me I needed to barricade myself inside before nightfall. As I left the dock, I heard something. A faint, eerie sound, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder as it cut through the stillness of the evening. The unmistakable sound of something large swimming just beneath the ice. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The cold, sharp air pressed in on me, but it wasn't the weather that made my skin crawl. It was the sound, slow, deliberate, and coming from just under the surface of the frozen lake. My heart pounded. I forced myself to keep moving, my legs feeling like lead as I climbed the stairs back to the condo, every sense on high alert. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the front door. I couldn't help it. My eyes kept darting back to it, waiting for something to happen. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded too loud, filling the silence in a way that only made the atmosphere more oppressive. I could feel my body tense with every passing minute. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly. My eyelids grew heavy. I don't remember when exactly I drifted off to sleep, but the next thing I knew, I woke with a start. My face was pressed against the cold surface of the kitchen table, my arms wrapped around my head. The clock on the wall read 3:02 a.m. And then I heard it. The sound of pounding, the violent splintering of wood. The front door was being rammed, again and again. I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me, my pulse racing. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and without thinking I scrambled to my feet. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked around, searching for somewhere to hide. I heard the door splinter again, and with a sickening crack, it burst open. I rushed toward the closest closet and slammed the door shut, pressing myself against the wall in the dark. My breath was ragged, barely audible over the thunderous pounding in my chest. My hands shook as I covered my mouth to keep from making a sound. My eyes widened in horror as I peered through the crack in the closet door. Something had entered the condo. I couldn't make out any distinct features in the dark, but it was enormous. Its movements were unnatural, staggered as though it had no control over its body. Each step it took was heavy, wet, and the stench, it was unbearable. A thick, putrid odor filled the room, the unmistakable smell of decaying flesh. It was like something dead had come to life. The figure moved deeper into the condo, its footsteps slapping against the tile floor, leaving behind a trail of wetness. I could hear its breath, guttural and ragged, as it drew closer to the back of the condo. My mind raced. I had to get out. I couldn't stay hidden forever. I knew the moment it found me, I wouldn't make it out alive. I made my move, bolting from the closet as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding in my throat as I raced toward the front door, now wide open, its frame splintered and warped. The night outside was my only chance. I didn't look back as I leapt over the wreckage of the door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, the cold biting at my skin. The engine of my car sputtered as I turned the key, refusing to start. I could hear the thing, whatever it was, getting closer, its steps coming closer and closer to the doorway. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored the accelerator. The tires spun on the snow-covered hill before they found traction. I sped up the hill, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The dark figure stood just outside the condo, too close for comfort, and I could see its silhouette against the dim light of the building. And then it happened. The scream. It was inhuman. So terrible, so filled with rage, it rattled the very core of my being. The sound echoed across the frozen landscape, and I knew, in that moment, that I had barely escaped whatever dark thing lurked at the lake. I didn't stop until I reached a town with cell service. My hands were still shaking as I called my parents, my voice breaking as I tried to explain what had happened. My father, hearing the panic in my voice, contacted the local authorities, urging them to investigate. They told us not to return to the condo, to stay away until they had everything sorted out. We never went back. A few days later, the building owner called my father. He had a story prepared, something about unexpected foundation issues that required the entire project to be demolished. He offered a check for 3 times the value of the condo as compensation for the inconvenience. He was insistent that we accept it. But the money didn't matter. After everything I had experienced, nothing could make me forget what I saw. I've come to 2 conclusions about the events at Lake of the Ozarks. The first is that something otherworldly is responsible for the disappearances and the drowned bodies. That lake hides something far worse than just cold currents and hidden dangers. The second possibility is even more terrifying. Those who have disappeared into the lake, they're not dead. Not all of them. Some of them are still out there, trapped beneath the surface, waiting to claw their way back to the shore. And I'm not sure which one is worse.
Stories may end, but the fear remains. Subscribe to uncover more secrets hidden in the darkness. Until we meet again in the world of nightmarish shadows.